It's a story we've been following all day for you. The National Institutes of Health has released a report about Junior Seau, revealing he had a debilitating brain disease. Joining me to take an in-depth look at what this means is Dr. Gupta. Thank you for coming to Primetime.
Taylor, thanks for having me.
Well, you know, and I have a personal connection with Junior, who's a friend of mine, and I care so deeply about him, and you know, his family obviously suffers a big loss, and San Diego as a whole suffered a big loss, and it was very confusing to everybody why he would commit suicide, and some answers have been given us to us today.
And that's the one, I think, wonderful thing about the research that's being done, is that we can finally come to some understanding that this was not Junior, this was not his behavior necessarily, or this was a disease process that took hold for him as a result of probably multiple subacute traumatic impacts that he had during the course of his sports career.
And 20 years in the NFL. I mean, can you imagine how many concussions he had? And if I'm correct, every time you have a concussion, you have a little bit of scar tissue in your brain.
Potentially. There's certainly the brain, like I have a model right here, and when you have a concussion, at a minimum the brain has been rocked inside the skull such that it's probably going to have hit the inside of the skull, and the skull even has some bony protrusions sometimes, so it can really cause some bleeds, and so potentially some scarring as well. Sometimes it's just some bruising in the brain. But it's never good for the brain. It's never something that we should take for granted, that if you have a concussion, some people say, call it like getting your bell rung, that you can just sort of walk it off, or that it's okay. It's a serious thing that should be regarded seriously.
So tell us about this brain disease, like what actually happens when you get concussions over and over again.
So this brain disease is called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And I'm just going to call it CTE. Okay. So CTE is a condition, it's a neurodegenerative condition, which means it affects the brain and is degenerative, meaning it's progressive, and over time people deteriorate, unfortunately. Oftentimes the symptoms don't show up until sometimes well after these guys have retired from professional sports.
And what are those symptoms?
So the symptoms, the early symptoms start out as things like a lot of short-term memory problems, some executive dysfunction, which is things like problems with planning, organizing, inhibition. People become really disinhibited and behave in ways they might not normally. They start to develop mood disorders, have a lot of apathy, some depression. They might even have some emotional instability. They might isolate themselves from other people. And of course, they have a lot of suicidal ideation, expressions of suicidal intent, and sometimes carry out suicide. Do
you think taking sleeping pills and alcohol would exacerbate the situation?
That's a good question, and it's good because it's so common. These poor guys who are suffering from this condition don't know what it is, don't know what's going on, but they're really crying out for some relief. They're really wanting some relief in some way. So it's important for us not to demonize them for turning to alcohol and drugs, to just get some relief from the way they're feeling. I think the poignancy of the pain is really expressed when you think about Dave Duerson. I think he played for the Chicago Bears, a defensive back, and he left a suicide note that said, "Please study my brain, find out what happened to me." I mean, to me that speaks to really how desperately he was trying to understand what was happening with him.
And some people aren't that in touch, or can't articulate what's going on, or feel ashamed. I mean, you don't know what's going on in their head, and they don't know. It's just so sad.
It's very sad. And there's other cases like Jovan Belcher, very recently at the end of last year, the Kansas City Chiefs. He was also in a position much like Junior Seau, and he was a running back, not a running back, a defensive back. But in any case, these guys they deliver really hard hits, and they take really hard hits as a result. And as you know, he murdered his girlfriend and then showed up to his training facility and shot himself in front of his coaches after expressing gratitude for all that they'd done for him. So these are really sad situations that we need to really better understand, so that we can manage and treat the illnesses.
It almost becomes like a mental disorder, like a, you know, maybe bipolar, you know, coupled with a psychosis. That's, I don't know. I mean, could be anything, take on any of those symptoms, right?
There's a lot of emotional instability, and there's a lot of cognitive problems that actually end up kind of deteriorating or progressing. So later on in the syndrome of CTE, we start to see worsening memory impairment, like much like what you'd see in Alzheimer's dementia. So there's problems with memory and recall, and problems with other cognitive functions, and then even language difficulties. And what's even scarier is motor disturbances, such as like you might find with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. So it's a profound illness that really progresses, and when it's not treated, progresses faster and can easily lead to suicide and worse, and has a tremendous impact on families.
So what do people do now? I mean, football is a contact sport. Rugby, I mean, there's so many contact sports out there, right? I mean, what do we do? We get rid of contact sports, or is there a way to reverse the signs, or how do we help these guys?
We need more research. The NFL just gave a grant to the National Institutes of Health of about $11 million, and that's terrific. And it's an important start, but it's just a drop in the bucket. They need to be much better funded to do lots more of these studies, so we can learn how to protect players, so that helmet design can be advanced further. We have a lot of technology at our disposal. We need to use it to really protect these guys, and standards need to be put in place. Again, the idea of getting a concussion is not something you walk off or you sit out for a quarter or a half. A concussion should be really evaluated carefully to see whether a player is truly fit to return. And if there's any residual symptoms, and maybe even if there's not, just to stay safe, we really need to make some tough decisions about maybe benching a player for a little longer.
And I would say that traditionally the player is a warrior, and they're going to like hide their symptoms because they want to go out and do what they're getting paid to do.
So we need to provide players with a lot more education as well. Sometimes they're shielded from a lot of this information too, because they're superstars, and everybody wants to see them continue to succeed.
However, if they knew that there were these long-term effects of brain damage,
yeah, they might think, well, look, I want to protect my brain, and I don't want to end up with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It used to be known as being punch drunk. Boxers used to have it, and that's a term coined in the 20s, and then later on they call it dementia pugilistica. But we're seeing kind of a distinct syndrome associated with football players and that kind of contact sport. And when you think about it, if we have time, there's a couple of different kinds of impacts the brain takes. There's these acceleration and then rapid deceleration forces, right? That are much more straightforward and easy to understand, and that really affects the outer part of the brain, the cortex. And then there's these sometimes rotational forces where they get hit with a glancing blow, and that twists the upper part of the brain. And since the brainstem's a lot more locked in, you get this twisting and shearing effect on the inside of the brain of the kind of the white matter. And the white matter is sort of the cables that connect different parts of the brain to each other, and it results in disconnection syndromes and just all kinds of the symptoms that I discussed earlier.
Well, obviously, there's got to be change in the way we've been doing things, and I'm hoping that something will be developed to help reverse some of the damage that's already been done.
We just need to continue to raise awareness and have football players and their family members really learn to recognize what the signs are of any kind of trouble.
It's very dangerous. And thank you so much for coming on Primetime and enlightening us on this subject.
Taylor, thanks for having me.
Thank you. We have to take a quick break. Primetime, we'll be right back.